So let's integrate a little further forecasting and supply chain management. Primary building block, we already said that, of sales and operations planning, supply chain management, and inventory management. If you were to make a Venn diagram, those concentric circles that you sometimes see of S&OP, supply chain management, and inventory management, forecasting would be right in the middle. That would be that common ground because it really does resonate out from the center and impact these areas. Bullet point number 2. We're going to introduce, I mentioned briefly these terms, but we're going to stop here and bring some additional definition because it's really quite important. Forecasting of independent demand. That's a term that we're going to stop and talk about. Permeates the entire supply chain. What does that mean? Independent demand forecasting is always about finished goods. How much do we think we're going to sell in the marketplace? That's independent demand. Dependent demand, which I alluded to within the context of material requirements planning, is the quantities of raw materials needed to manufacture products. So we have a forecast for how much product, finished product, we think we're going to sell. Now, the amount of raw materials that either we or our contract manufacturer needs to acquire to meet that forecast depends upon the quantity in the forecast. That's the difference between independent, finished goods demand, and dependent raw materials demand. This will come up again and again, so if it seems a little cloudy right now, not to worry. What's of equal importance for now, last hash mark on this slide, is that both independent and dependent demand impact inventory levels, raw materials, work in process, finished goods, etc., throughout the entire supply chain. Characteristics of the forecasting discipline. We're going to offer up some even further and very important, equally important terminology. Consuming the forecast. This is the first time we've mentioned this explicitly, but we've actually talked about it quite a bit. And it is the cornerstone of sales and operations planning. What that means is we've talked over and over again about forecasting out into the future, and then actual activity starts to take place. Customers are buying goods. And then we look at the variances between what we thought was going to happen and what really happened. That's really what consuming the forecast is. So we might forecast for the first 5 weeks of a year, 100 items a month for let's call it the first 5 months of the year, 100 items a month, just to make it a simple conversation. And as we move forward and start to get orders for customers, let's say in the first month we got 80 orders for 80 units. Well, that forecast, which was 100, has now been consumed up to 80. That's actual activity. Those are actual customer orders. We are consuming the forecast, our prediction of what was going to happen in the future, with actual orders. And that's what allows us, that's what triggers the adjustments that we can make up or down in our sales and operations planning activity. Forecasts, second bullet point, should be carried out on a long, medium, short, and immediate basis. Long might be a year, medium, 6 months, short for a quarter. And also performed, last bullet point, only, and this is where we start to bring additional meaning to our recently introduced terminology, forecasts should be performed only for independent demand items, meaning finished goods. How many pairs of shoes do we think we're going to sell in the month of September? How many laptops are we going to sell in the back-to-school period? Those are finished goods, independent demand items. Dependent demand, just to reiterate, are all the raw materials that go into the pair of shoes, that go into the laptop. So the amount of raw materials that the manufacturer, be it ourselves or a third-party manufacturer, has to acquire is dependent upon the forecast for the finished goods. So if I put one chip into a computer, that's not very likely, but let's use it as an example. I put one chip into a computer as raw material, my independent demand for a laptop is going to be 1,000. My dependent demand for that particular raw material, that chip, is also 1,000. So raw materials related to dependent demand, finished goods related to independent demand. When we talk forecasting, there's no need to do dependent demand, because if we know the raw materials that go into a finished good, the raw materials will depend upon, the quantity of raw materials are going to depend upon how many finished goods we're going to sell. More on that in just a bit. Some other characteristics of forecasting. We have to consider cycles, long-term cycles, maybe fashion cycles. Every 5 years, bell-bottom pants come back into style. Trends are clear movements in a specific direction. Smartphone sales have gone up 25% a year, compound growth for the last 5 years. Seasonality, holiday season, back to school, all seasonal items, and random variation. These are activities or occurrences in a supply chain that there's really no explanation for. It's just kind of a random thing, but you have to be in a position to try to understand random variation as best as possible. It's called random for a reason, so it's a little hard to identify, but you have to be cognizant of it. But in forecasting, if you're not considering cycles, trends, seasonality, the forecast is never going to be right. Think about the retail industry, moving into our hash mark on our first bullet point. Here in the United States, but certainly in other parts of the world as well. The seasons, the time of year. We talked about back to school. We talked about the holiday season. How about events, Mother's Day, or other events? It's something that's a recent phenomenon in China. To broaden our conversation is Singles Day, where kind of an invented holiday, but people are encouraged, single people are encouraged to go out and buy gifts for themselves and their friends. $10 billion in sales took place on Singles Day in China in 2014. Obviously, forecasts have to take that kind of activity into consideration. And a little further into the retail industry is this whole idea of a retail calendar, and especially multinational retailers like a Zara that has over 5,000 stores, women's fast fashion around the world. This is really recognition of different practices, different activities in different geographic and cultural markets, where the retail calendar in the U.S. is driven by back to school, holiday season. Well, there are plenty of countries around the world that don't celebrate the holiday season the way the United States does, but they will have their own retail calendar that recognizes seasons and events and holidays. It's different around the world, and I've seen personally, working in this industry, companies that start in one country aren't sensitive to a retail calendar in another country, and their forecasting couldn't be any more incorrect. So that sensitivity globally to different markets, different geographies, all part of forecasting. One thing that's clear, second bullet point here also, and this has been proven out across multiple industries, not just retail, is that forecasts are more accurate for families or groups of products. So a product family could be women's cotton tops, basics as they're sometimes called, or men's athletic footwear. Easier to forecast for that than a specific model of footwear or tennis or tennis shoe or sneaker. So lots of companies, and again, not just retail, but lots of companies start with forecasts for product families or groups and then get more specific. The other point is, last bullet here, is that forecasts are more accurate for nearer time periods. It's just easier in any facet of life, if you think about it, to predict what you're going to be doing tomorrow, as an example, as opposed to what you're going to be doing a year from today. Same applies to companies. It's just easier to see nearer terms. So it's easier to forecast for nearer time periods as opposed to out a year, or even 6 months.